I might have gone a little off piste when I was preparing my lecture because I thought, oh, and pollen, I know bird that's pollinate can do this and they can do that. So I think, yeah, so I've gone off piste, but I also thank you for bringing up the project that we're just starting, which is the smoke project. We had a sort of a bit of a pilot last year, but we are really hoping, particularly in the interior, to find people who are interested in monitoring their nectar use, uh, because that's a very non-invasive way of finding out how the birds are using the resources we put out under many different environmental conditions, particularly smoke, which of course we don't want to be catching them in. So thank you so much for mentioning that. And if anybody is interested, please just get in contact with me at hummingbird at rpbo.org. Now, thank you very much for coming. That's really nice. And I'm going to talk in general about bird pollinators and slightly in random as to what came out to me as being interesting today. So I'm afraid there are a few graphs, not mine, but I thought they would be interesting things to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen and start the PowerPoint. And I think you should be
There we
seeing
go.
the screen now.
Yeah, it's nice and clear, Alison.
So this is not a native bird. This is a wattle bird from Australia, but it's illustrating something that you're going to see as a little theme in this talk, which is we've focused a lot on hummingbirds in the past, but in actual fact, a lot of songbirds are actually really important pollinators too. And you can see the pollen all over this wattle bird's face. So we'll get into it in a minute, but this is a teaser. So this is what we're talking about, pollen. And pollen can be small, it can be large, it can have very, very different shapes, often dependent on its mode of transport. Does it need to stick to something? Does it need to float in the wind? And so it's a really interesting topic because there are so many ways that pollination can come about. And we're going to talk in general about sort of one aspect only. So the topics for today are going to be just a primer and a reminder on what is pollination. Then I want to actually, you see, I told you I went off piste, talk a bit about evolution and what you need to be a good pollinator. What would be helpful to be a good pollinator? And for hummingbirds, we think of hovering. So what kind of adaptation did that require to be able to access them? We'll think about things like drinking nectar because that's the reward. And then a slightly more subtle one is tasting nectar. And I'll leave that one up till when we get there because that's kind of a fun one. And then finally, I'd like to think about pollination networks and specifically something that we've been doing here at RPBO and working with a researcher in the States to look at the pollination networks of songbirds and hummingbirds. So I'll talk to you a bit about that. So just as a beginner, what is pollination? Pollination is basically when you're bringing the male, it's called a gamete, the male parts, the pollen, in touch with the female parts. So the egg and the pollen are coming together to make an embryo. And the pollen is on something called an anther. So if you see that yellow blobby bit, it's being held out as a stamen, has a long filament and then a big blobby anther. And all the pollen's on there in this picture. There's other ways of doing it, but in this picture. And that has to then make it to the stigma, which will take it down to the egg, the ovule. And when the two come together and fuse, you get an embryo. And you'll see in this picture, I've got sugar down there. Because when we are giving a reward for this, the plants will generally provide sucrose. Now, if we think about photosynthesis, what photosynthesis makes is sugar. And so sugar is a very easy reward for them to give, and it's energetically valuable for the pollinator. The results of pollination are the fruit and the seed. Now, the seed is obviously got the new plant, the ability to make a new plant, and the fruit can be either fleshy, like we see in these salal berries, or dry. So imagine the wings on a maple, with a little whirligig coming down. That's a dry fruit. So the fruit's the outer casing that enables that seed to be transported to wherever it needs to be. So the flowering plants, some of them use wind pollination, like grasses, but most of them have come into a bit of a bargain with animal pollinators. And there are many, many animals that provide this service. They can be insects, they can be bats, they can be lizards, they can be marsupials. My mum's dog is a very, very active pollinator. They can also be birds. And on this hummingbird, you can see lovely yellow pollen on its head and on its throat. And these animals are doing pollen delivery. So the male taking it to the female, so you get the seeds for a nectar, a sugar reward. Now, pollination is interesting. I mean, why did it arise? Why did animal pollinators form this partnership? Well, the evidence is interesting. The first bird that has been associated with pollen was found in the Messel pits in Germany, and it was dated to about 47 million years ago. And they found two different types of pollen in its stomach. So this is the first time the two have been associated. And the reason why it is valuable for a flowering plant to use a pollinator is they get much more efficient delivery. It costs a lot in energy and resources to make pollen and the gametes. And if you're using wind, you have to make tons of it. Think about what like your cedars are like or your Doug firs are like in the spring. There's just, there's drifts of pollen. That's expensive. But if you can get a courier service to deliver it, you won't have to make as much. And if you can pay the courier in something like photosynthate, all the better. So you can see how it benefits both partners. But there's an interesting thing where bird pollinators are often preferred, the preferred partner of plants, and they'll co-evolve with them. So when we look at this bumblebee, bumblebees are 6 times more efficient than honeybees, and they're native, yay. Um, so if we look at this bumblebee and you follow that little blue arrow, you can see a pollen basket. So a bumblebee is going to pollinate the plant, but it's going to groom a lot of that pollen into the pollen basket. And it's going to work every single flower on that plant. So you get a lot more what's called self-pollination. And a lot of plants need to be pollinated by a different plant. You can't clone yourself. So it's really important for outcrossing to be able to do that. Now, if we look at the hummingbird on the left instead, the hummingbird is not grooming that pollen. What got stuck on it got delivered to the next plant and all the other plants. A hummingbird can also travel further. So you see a lot more of your genes dispersing in the environment than just being kept in a very close area. So it's efficient delivery, and it's actually possibly a more valuable delivery from a genetic distribution aspect. So let's think about when the birds are transferring the pollen. What's happening? So I've got a salvia here on the left. You can see that. And you can see in the middle panels the flower, and then they've cut that flower away. And you can see that where the white arrow is in the C panel, that's where the nectar is. So that's where the sugar is going to be. So the bird is going to have to stick its tongue right to the back to pick up the sugar. Meantime, it's going to bump its head into those stamens. So if you look in the picture, you can see those yellow blobs I talked about. Those are the stamens that are full of pollen. So on the right panel, you can see that those stamens are loading pollen onto the head of the bird. Now, if you remember back to my picture a few seconds ago, that bird had pollen on the front of its head and on its throat. That pollen wouldn't transfer to this flower because it's in the wrong place. So another thing that plants do to make sure that they have direct delivery is locate the pollen deposition in a certain location. And the stigma is that little Y that's protruding past the stamens. It will pick up pollen from the place where a salvia deposited. Another plant would deposit, say, on the neck and only pick up from the neck. And this way, you're making sure your courier service is going from the correct plant to the correct plant, even though they visit quite a few different types of plant. So what we see then is that there has been substantial coevolution between the plants and their pollinators. So the flowers are really becoming better and better suited over evolution to let their pollinator do a better job. Now, in this picture, you can see two types of hummingbird, and they're both hovering, aren't they? So, hovering is a really good way to access nectar. And if we're thinking about that, let's think how hummingbirds hover. A lot of birds don't hover, but some do. We see the raptors hovering, for example. But let's look at what's special about the hummingbird wing that allows it to hover. So, hummingbirds have all the same bones as we do, but most of their wing, about 70% of their wing, is actually really attached to the hand. It's a hand wing. And I don't normally talk about this, but so this is sort of something that's kind of new for this talk. So if we look at the left-hand side, you can see about 75% of the size is on the hand wing. If we look at a pigeon, only about half of it is. So it's going to bend its wing when it flaps upwards. Now, what does that mean for hovering? Well, we all know that birds get lift when they flap down. But I'd like you to look at this. This picture shows the air turbulence following an upward stroke of the wing. They're getting about 25% lift on the upstroke. Instead of folding their wing to raise it, they're actually tilting the whole thing and lifting still. So it's not as powerful as the downstroke, but both up and downstroke allow lift, which allows hovering. So I hope that makes sense, but now when you watch the wing, you'll see that it doesn't fold up. And so we said that these flowers have developed co-evolved with their pollinators. And when the pollinator is a bird, we call these ornithophilous traits. Ornith being bird, and philo refers to love, bird-loving flowers. So what kind of things would we think about looking for? Well, bright colors. We put out red feeders. Birds can see red. Insects can't see red. So we often see things that are visited by birds rather than insects being red. Generally, there's no scent. We think of scent as being things for nighttime, moths and so on. Nothing like landing lines. They're not looking for the landing lines like you would have with bees, and there's none of the UV absorbent stuff going on in general, as far as we know. The other thing is we see that the sexual structures are really placed for hummingbirds. And so this plant here, you would have to be a hovering pollinator to access it. So those are the kind of things we look for. Now, where we live up here, the birds are here across the season. And so they don't have individual partnerships. They're quite general. They're generalists. They'll go to all sorts of things, even flowers that are, also visited by insects. So it's not as a tight a relationship as you would get in the tropics. But we do clearly have flowers that have co-evolved with hummingbirds. So if you were paying attention, I think you saw that I said something about Germany. And they found sort of a close approximation to a hummingbird, swifty thing, also over in Asia, in Europe. So Eurasia was where the hummingbirds as such first evolved. But nowadays, they're only in the New World, in North America, Central America, and South America. So how did they get here? Well, we don't have any fossil evidence for them before 20 million, 22 million years ago in South America. But there are sort of clues that they might have been places. So, like in Africa, in Eastern tropical Africa, this Canarina, is what looks to me like an ornithophilous flower. And in fact, nowadays, it would be visited by sunbirds and long-tongued bees. But there are many flowers like impatiens and campanula and Cape fuchsia that clearly have ornithophilous traits and are perhaps indicative of having had an association with hummingbirds and then having to find an alternative partner. And quite often, when we look in our gardens, I know a number of us grow South African plants, plants like the red hot pokers or the angel's fishing rods or the Cape fuchsias. And these are great nectar providers. And maybe they're just getting that association back again. So if you did have to move over to a different bird pollinator, it tends to be a passerine. And the sunbirds are a really large group of passerines, but they're not great hoverers. They can do a little bit of flappy flappy, but they're not fabulous hoverers. So plants that now associate with them tend to be a little bit sturdier. So they often have landing sites to them, whereas the ones that are stuck with the hummingbirds tend to be without a landing site. So, on to my next component of being a nectar drinker. We said that you got nectar for delivering pollen. And in general, that's true. I mean, there are other options. There can be traps, there can be intoxication, they can pretend to be mate. But in general, that it's a nectar provision. And the first animals that found that obviously had a competitive advantage over everything else because they had that great source of energy. So to to recognize nectar, you have to be able to drink it. And so what we see as an adaptation in the hummingbirds is a very specialized tongue. So that tongue has to go out as long as the bill. And you'll see the line in blue. That's a chain of bones called hyoid bones. And it allows the tongue to kind of curl up over the back and then it pushes the tongue out when it's drinking nectar. So if you look at the bird feeding at your feeder, you'll see it's sort of like its eyebrow area going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And that's because the tongue support, that hyoid apparatus, is going back and forth round the back of the ear. So I've got a little video to show you about, oh no, I got one more slide because I want you to watch out for this is going to be a quiz at the end here. Um, how hummingbirds drink. Now they're going to stick their tongue out, but I want you to look at the bottom panel, that panel B first, and I want you to see that there's two parts to the tongue with a very fluffy end on it. And when that root comes in, those roll up as grooves, as almost tubes, bringing the nectar back in. So as we watch the following video, I want you to think about seeing that split tongue and seeing the groove effect as they show it. I'm going to stop sharing this one and I'm going to start sharing this one. Yeah. I should be able to make it bigger. Here we go.
Hummingbirds do everything in a hurry. When they drink nectar, their tongue flicks in and out 15 times a second, or faster. The nectar rushes up two grooves in the bird's tongue, which is split, like a snake's. That was thought to happen through capillary action, the way liquid moves up a narrow straw, without suction. But University of Connecticut researchers say that's not how it works. Using feeders set up in natural environments and high-speed video, they show that the tongue works like a kind of pump. In the bird's beak, the tongue is compressed and it stays that way as it shoots out. Once it reaches the nectar, it springs open, and that rapid expansion draws up the fluid. It's a new wrinkle in the evolution of birds, flowers, very strange tongues.
In contrast, it's interesting to think that the passerine tongue is not quite the same, and they actually do use a suction system, which is quite interesting. But I'm not going to show that tonight just for ease of delivery. So I hope you saw that the split tongue and those fluffy ends and the grooving idea. No, my my there we go. So the next thing I think we should think about is how do birds taste sugar? And here there's a honey eater and it's eating the honeydew from some scale insects. And that long twizzly thing is actually an anal tube and a little drop of honey will appear at the end. Honeydew will appear at the end. And so a lot of animals like honeydew. So that's how do they taste this? And this is something I didn't tell you about before, but I think is really kind of cool. So that's why we're doing it. In genetics, you have a use it or lose it system. And basically, the dinosaurs lost it, and birds are dinosaurs. So, dinosaurs lost the ability to taste sweet. And yet, we know the passerine and the hummingbird on these shots They can taste sweet. They recognize sweet. So what's going on? Then I want to show you a really cool piece of research done by Maud Baldwin. So it turns out that hummingbirds and passerines have taken the receptor that would taste savory, the umami receptor, and they have made that, altered it so it can taste sweet. Oops, I got excited. So what I'm saying here is they have made mutations to the receptor, and it now sort of recognizes savory, but it really recognizes sugar. So if we look at these graphs, if you look on the blue ones, you can see the mouse and the chicken and the swift, and those curves all head straight up. The hummingbird, yeah, not really. That's savory. Those are components that make up proteins. On the bottom in red, sugars, sucrose, fructose, glucose. And we go along, mouse, chicken, swift, nobody's reacting. You get to the hummingbird and it's, whoa! So they have the ability to taste sugar. So that's kind of interesting, I think. And when you look at it, many songbirds take nectar. And it turns out that they have modified a different part of the receptor. It happened too. It wasn't the same modification. It was something called a coevolution. Sorry, convergent evolution. It also happened. So this ability in the passerines is seen across a whole pile of gills. So a gill is a sort of, in this case, I'm talking about omnivores, they eat lots of different stuff, or frugivores, they eat fruits, or invertivores, they eat invertebrates, so things without a vertebral column, things like insects and spiders. And a granivore is a grain eater. And when you look at various examples, you find nectar eaters among all of them. And what that tells us is that sweet tasting occurred extremely early in the passerine lineage. And now I can tell you why I had that Australian bird drinking its nectar out of the honeydew, because in Australia and Australasia, South Australasian area, there was a lot of sugar around. It was a really abundant resource. And the passerines, we think, I mean, you know, you always got to get new evidence, maybe, but most people think that the passerines evolved in that area where there was a lot of sugar. And so why do some not taste sugar now? We'll use it or lose it. So that's the thought. And my final thing that I was going to say, and I think I might have run through my slides a bit quickly, is that what we then see are pollination networks. So in a pollination network, you may see multiple pollinators going to one type of flower. And so say you're looking in your garden and you see a bee going there and a hummingbird going there, and maybe a hoverfly goes there. There can be multiple pollinators. But sometimes those pollinators may only go to one flower. And sometimes a flower may only have one pollinator. So in a complex network, you can have some members being overlapping and some members being tight only to eat themselves. So one thing that we've been talking to you over Pollinator Weeks for a few years now is that Yannicka was participating in the Songbirds as Pollinator project that was running being run by Carolyn Coyle as part of her PhD research. And here you can see Yannicka swabbing an orange-crowned warbler. So she would swab the passerines or key passerines, and she would swab hummingbirds. And then what Carolyn did was sequence the DNA to figure out what these pollinator networks were. And I had the great pleasure of watching her defense, her thesis defense, which was extremely interesting. But what caught me is she showed the complex pollinator network for our area. And the passerines were going to so many different floral resources, lots and lots of different flowers. The hummingbirds were going to lots and lots and lots of resources, but they weren't necessarily completely overlapping. Now, maybe with more research, we'd find they did overlap. But if we think about what a warm-blooded pollinator brings to this partnership, they bring the ability to do a very direct delivery, and they also don't really slow down in poor weather. And so they're often giving an early season and a basal level of pollination to ecosystems. And it seems like many systems, say up at high altitude or remotely, can really be very dependent on their bird pollinators. So, in conclusion, what I've talked about so far is that pollination is basically when you bring a male and a female gamete together to form an embryo. The evolution of these bird pollinators has been a coevolution. And so the flower has evolved to make itself better suited to its pollinator partner. And often the bird, particularly in the tropics, where they don't have to be generalists, will have adaptations, say, to the bill shape that really coincide with its partner flower. And that makes a much tighter network than maybe what we have in a more generalist system. Remember, I said when we looked at the network, there were many, many floral partners. We talked about hovering, and that is the most energetic form of flight. And we get lift on the up and down stroke. And it's one of the reasons why I'm starting this smoke project, because hovering is the most energetic form of flight. A third of the weight of the breast muscle in a hummingbird is something called mitochondria, the little power sources in the muscle, and that needs oxygen. And if you can't breathe properly, you're going to have a really hard time hovering. Drinking, they have evolved a very specific tongue shape to really, really take advantage of that nectar resource. So in the hummingbird tongue, we have the split tongue that goes out and it rolls up, bringing in the nectar. In the passerine tongue, it is actually more of a suction system to do with sucking up against the upper part of the bill, bringing the nectar back, and then creating a vacuum, allowing it all to shoot into the mouth. These birds have also had to figure out how, or not had to figure out, had a mutation that allowed them to taste sugar. They've had a mutation in the savory tasting receptor so that it recognizes sugars and they can taste sweet and identify it. And in fact, hummingbirds are so knowledgeable. They know where their food is. I don't know if you've ever moved your feeder and all the hummingbirds visited where it used to be last year. but they know where all the feeders, they know where all the food is on their whole route. They have a prodigious memory, and that's not just their breeding grounds, it's their migration, it's their wintering grounds. In fact, on migration, in the spring, we can catch up to 40% returnees just because they are so dedicated to root, often in consecutive band numbers. And um, these birds even know the refill rate of flowers. So if you have an artificial flower that fills every 20 minutes and one that fills every 10 minutes, the 10-minute one gets visited every 10 minutes and the 21 gets visited every 21 minutes. It's quite amazing. And then these birds participate in pollination networks. Now, up here, where they're generalists, these are very complex networks and they're not necessarily overlapping. So, when we're thinking about conservation, we think about many organisms doing overlapping jobs. And I like to think of it a bit like a table with 100 legs. But if you start pulling away the legs, eventually you get down to two and the table tips over because there's not enough jobs being done. And when you think about these networks, the more they're not overlapping, when there's not overlaps, those are the areas that are very, very vulnerable to loss if they lose their partner uh, in the pollination. So on that note, I'll say any questions, and I hope I haven't been too quick tonight. Um, but thank you very much. Anybody got any questions?
Alison, absolutely fantastic. I'm gobsmacked. I
Oh,
cannot believe some of that information. I'll just invite everyone to either raise your hand or speak up, or we're happy to accept questions in the chat as well if you prefer.
I do know I went off piece, but it happens.
Pretty amazing.
Any questions at all?
Oh, oh,
Rosa.
Rosa?
Yeah, I was wondering if you're seeing any difference in numbers of Rufous this year compared to last year.
Yes, we actually had a return. This is the first year I've had any hope in a very long time. We had very young individuals return this year, and we've had pretty good breeding of those. So we are terribly down. I mean, we're talking 45.6% decrease in the last 10 years. But it is, if they get a good year and they can get down and they can get back up, they can, each female will have four babies. So they can rebuild. They just need a few decent years in a row. And that's the big worry with the particulate, the smoke. Um, the reason why I worry about them allowing people to burn into May when my first birds were breeding in March, middle of March, because yeah, an adult bird can fly away, but a nestling can't go anywhere. And then there's wildfire and so on. So I worry about the droughts for the insects because they need to eat insects to drink nectar. So I'm hopeful. The rain is awesome. The lack of fire is awesome. If we can have 2 years in a row, oh, that's really great. That'll really help. But we don't have many males. There are some, but not a lot. Okay, and does that answer your question, Rosa? Yes, in
Yes, thank
essence, and I
you.
went on a long time.
No, yes, it was very useful, and I counted more at Gordon's Beach this year than previous years, which is why I asked my question.
Yeah, we actually had survivorship last year. Our babies, in general, I don't think are surviving the coastal transit.
Mm.
So they're having better survivorship in the interior than we are. Our babies aren't making it down the coast.
One more question. Annas can have multiple batches in a year. Do Rufous do that or just one?
Just the two. They're overlapping. So we see the eggs before we see the fledglings because they get too big to sit on, so you might as well sit on eggs. Also, they start to eat a lot, so the resources go into eggs, and while they're not eating too much, and then when they're feeding too much, you're just sitting, you know, and feeding.
Wow. Alison, are you able to see the question from Anne in the chat?
Okay, I'll put, sorry, I didn't have the chat page up.
That's
Without
okay.
overlap, does that
Yeah.
mean the plants may disappear or can insects do the job? It just depends. In our systems, we locally we're looking at a lot of overlap with a lot of different species. In a lot more say tropical systems, absolutely, it's a huge problem. The other big problem is alien plants, which are disrupting the networks. But in our system, less so of a worry. But I can't say no because we don't know who the insect visitors would be. So on tighter network associations, it's quite possible, but I don't truly know. It's good question though. Thank you.
Yeah.
And anybody who didn't notice, it was Anne's garden that was rewilded and had ethical rewilding. So in the social media posts, which I thought was kind of pretty cool. We came up with this as a thing to write about for Pollinator Week when we were being skunked trying to catch hummingbirds at the hatchery, and they were just basically at our elbows where there was some columbines, and they weren't going anywhere near our traps. Anybody else have
Okay.
any questions? No?
Yeah, I don't see any. I don't see any others coming in, but to just remind everyone, Alison, it's Hummingbird at RPBO to reach you. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Or me at development at rpbo.org.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone so much. I hope I see you next week for the gardening presentation, but thank you so much for your interest in our hummingbird work and protecting those little flying jewels. And we
And
really appreciate your time.
and I
Okay.
reiterate that. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, everybody, and happy hummingbirding and songbirding. And Kaylee, I'll see you tomorrow.